Well, before I get into the talk that I was brought here today to talk about, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of background about my practice, which is quite diverse. A lot of what I deal with is commemoration. I've done a lot of work with historic cemeteries, which you see here. This is Drummond Hill Cemetery in Niagara Falls. And it's a very old cemetery for that part of Canada. It dates from like the late 18th century. But about over 20 years ago, I did a conservation master plan of the cemetery, all the monuments, with a friend and colleague of mine. So it is also a battlefield. The Battle of Lundy's Lane, a very important battle in the War of 1812. And that was one of the monuments we dealt with. And of course, good old Laura Secord, how can we forget Laura? And probably Drummond Hill Cemetery was one of the, other than the falls, it's probably one of the first tourist attractions after the War of 1812. An enterprising individual built a platform that once you went up the stairs, you could look down onto the battlefield. You paid a little bit of money, and then you went and had a look. I'm not sure what you were seeing, but you had a look. Okay. This is another project of mine. I may be familiar to many of you, Royal Military College. This is the Memorial Arch in Kingston. This was built, it was opened in 1923, so it was a memorial to the students, the cadets, and graduates of the college. It's an absolutely beautiful arch. It is a true cenotaph, and a cenotaph, I'm not sure if people are familiar, cenotaph comes from the Greek for empty tomb. So we and the Brits made the decision not to repatriate or war dead. They were buried where it's basically, not maybe kind of close to where they fell. So cenotaphs after the First World War sprouted up, and they gave people within communities, big and small, a place where they could commemorate their lost ones. Like so many cenotaphs, with future conflicts, little things were added to it. In some cases, it was just an extra plaque. In this case, the two pylons that you see on either side were added after the Second World War. And that's just the side of one of them. I was working with an engineer. We were looking at the condition of the stone and the bronze, and as you can see, there are a few condition issues. And much closer to home, this is the Harvard Collegiate War Memorial. This is what he looked like when we were brought in to treat him. This is what he looked like historically. All that's changed around him is the landscaping. And this is what he looks like after treatment. We had to make him a new bayonet because those always seem to get stolen. And I think he needs another one. But what was really interesting was this was rededicated November 11th, 2005. So it was a big anniversary for the Second World War. There were a bunch of dignitaries there, but also school kids. So they had an all-school, everybody came together. I think it's grade 10, but don't quote me on that, I'm not up on curriculum. Whatever grade you were in when you dealt with the topic, they were outside, and everyone else in the commencement was inside in the auditorium, and it was live streamed. So it was, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with this monument. He does not look heroic, he looks scared, and quite frankly, who wouldn't be, right? He's a boy. And it's quite poignant when you look around at the kids. A lot of them are not a whole lot younger than he was when we went to him. So one of the really cool, so it was probably the most moving of these ceremonies I've ever been to, including the fact that the Lancaster bomber flew over us while we were there. Yeah, which was pretty darn cool, because it's an unmistakable sound. On his way to Prospect Cemetery, which is the last project I'm going to show you now. This is the Cross of Sacrifice at Prospect Cemetery, and then I'm going to move on to what I'm here to talk about. Okay, here you go. From monuments to jets, there we go. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the stabilization of the CF-100 all-weather jet, and this is a case study. So the Cold War era CF-100 all-weather jet fighter, or Canuck as it was often called, was the first all-Canadian fighter interceptor. It was designed and fabricated by Avro Canada at its Moulton facility. Historically, this facility is important as it manufactured Lancaster bombers during the Second World War. And this is that facility during the war, building the Lancasters. At that time, the company was called Victory Aircraft. It was a Crown corporation. After the war, it was sold to Avro Canada Limited, also known as Avro Canada. So it came from the guy's initials in his name. Okay, so the Canuck was engineered to fly and be combat ready in all weather conditions, from the extreme heat of the desert to the sub-zero conditions of the Arctic. The CF-100 responded to the RCAF's post-war commitment to home defense, NORAD, and NATO. The jets were produced from 1951 to 1958, and the last one retired from service after service in 1981. In 1974, a local branch of the Legion mounted a decommissioned CF-100 Mark V on a concrete pylon in Wildwood Park in Mississauga. And it was an historical memento commemorating both Avro and the CF-100. The jet sat seemingly with little to no maintenance until 2011, when a call from a concerned citizen to the mayor's office prompted the city of Mississauga to commission a full condition assessment of the jet. The concerned citizen was afraid it was going to fall off. And I can't tell you how many phone calls I get for things that are going to fall off that don't, thankfully. So I was hired to undertake to do the assessment. My report outlined the condition issues and made recommendations for the long-term preservation and stabilization of the jet, and included budget costing for the work recommended. A conservation approach was taken, and treatment that I developed strived to stabilize the jet in its current location while addressing the obvious conservation concerns. So today I'm going to share with you the preservation of Moulton CF-100 Mark V fighter jet. Our jet was by no means complete. Both engines had been removed and the openings sealed. Ferrous blanking plates covered the intake cowlings at the front of the engine, and the plywood plugs sealed the openings at and aft. The landing gear had been removed to facilitate mounting, and the resulting gap sealed with sheet metal patches, as you can see there. Most of the equipment had been removed from the interior of the jet when it was decommissioned. The pilot and navigator seats were extant, and 2 flight helmets, complete, these are real helmets, complete with goggles, headphones, and respirators, were wired in place to simulate a flight crew. The condition assessment was undertaken with the aid of a Toypin articulated lift, which you see here. The flexibility of the lift combined with the skill of the operator gave me full access to the jet, which was great. And they actually, the city owns that, and they bought it to change the lights in all their stadia. That's why they bought it. Comes in handy for me. Okay, so exposure to the elements for close to 40 years had corroded the outer aluminum layer of the jet's alclad aluminum skin, leaving much of the surface dull and gray and chalky looking. Now, some of you may be asking, what is alclad? Well, alclad is a corrosion-resistant aluminum sheet formed from a high-purity aluminum top layer over a high-strength aluminum alloy core material, which is called duralumin. It's kind of like an open-faced sandwich, where the top layer of your sandwich is the pure aluminum layer, and then underneath is the corrosion-resistant alloy. And then they're rolled together. These alclad has been around since the 1920s and was actually developed for aircraft, so it's specifically developed for that. Okay, it had survived in some sheltered areas like under the jet, but you can see there's some delamination happening. So the really dull layer is the bottom layer, and the shinier layer is the pure aluminum layer. Exposure of the core metal had led to localized areas of pitting and small losses due to corrosion, which you can see here. There was a significant crack in this, maybe what the concerned citizen was concerned about, I don't know, in the rudder, and it appeared on both sides. And this, the citizen was, and more than one I think, concerned that it was structurally unsound and was at risk of harming the public. So I don't think it was, but we have to respond to that sort of thing. So I did recommend that they monitor it on a regular basis. Okay, so the rudder trim tab had been secured to the tail cone with baling wire. Unfortunately, like so many of these projects, we have no documentation, so I have no idea when this was done. My guess is it was probably done when it was installed in the 70s. Most of the ferrous fasteners were corroding. Originally, they would have had a protective layer of either zinc or cadmium plating on top of them, and the loss of the plating, of course, led to their corrosion. With the exception of the areas where the skin had been lost to corrosion, and those removed to mount the jet, the aluminum skin was reasonably intact. A few small localized tears, like you see here, did exist, but otherwise it was in pretty good shape. The deformations we see on the port and starboard sides of the fuselage likely date from when the jet was slung into place. This damage is really quite unfortunate, particularly because we know that the wings can come off for transport. And as we can see in this archival photograph, you don't see the wings, they're off. Okay, the paint, both the red and black anti-glare paint on the fuel tanks had faded and failed in a number of areas. The decals on top of the wings were almost completely lost. Not too surprisingly, they fared better than those on the sides, worse than the ones on the sides, who looked to be pretty good, including the crest. It's slightly delaminating, but it's pretty good. The neoprene de-icing boots on the wings and the tail were degraded and faded. And the paint on this is the plywood plug that's in the back of the aft of the engine, that faded and failed in a number of areas, and the water staining and organic growth that you can see here indicates that over the years, water had been collecting there and eventually draining out of the jet. The plexiglass canopy and laminated glass windscreen were not in good condition. The windscreen was cracked on the front and port sides, and the interference colors, i.e. the rainbow colors that you see here, are due to the failure of the adhesive that laminates the layers of glass together. The cracks likely came from local vandals, because this is in a little parkette, and there's a lot of woods around it, so there's not a lot of eyes on the street. The paint surrounding the windscreen was severely weathered, faded, and failing in locations. And that's just the sealant that's no longer sealing. And the aluminum at the base of the canopy looked more like degraded wood than it did like corrosion. And at first I thought, wood? No, they didn't put wood on jets in the 50s. This is a kind of aluminum corrosion. It's called lamellar corrosion, and it's an absolutely stunning example of lamellar corrosion. The interior of the cockpit was really, really sad. There were mounds of bird poop, indicating that the resident birds had been roosting in the cockpit for a considerable length of time. The flight helmets had not fared well. In addition to the degradation you can see here, the navigator's helmet had fallen out of alignment, leaving his head facing aft rather than forward. It's hard to navigate looking backwards. There was a considerable buildup of debris, organic matter, and soil in both of the intake cowlings. And for the rye drinkers in the crowd, you will recognize, yes, indeed, that is Crown Royal. Although it's been there in hot bottom, it's empty, and it's been there a very long time. The soil that you see built up in the bottom of the cowling, it was like compost. So clearly it had been there a really long time. Okay, and the bird droppings that we saw on top of the intake cowlings indicated that the birds clearly found them a convenient perch. If I didn't dislike pigeons before this project, I really did after. And by far the biggest concern was the birds that had been using the interior of the jet as a nesting site for a really long time. Mounds of droppings in the jet, cockpit, and on the ground, that's in the cockpit, were a clear indication of their long-term presence. And there you can see it on the ground. It was really gross, actually. By 2011, there was a large opening in the belly of the jet, allowing the birds easy access. So originally this would have been sealed, but over time it was not, and the birds were, it was just like a big Pigeon Hotel. The attempts to seal it initially were not brilliant to begin with, but they really did fail as time went on. So it's likely that the first birds that moved in were smaller birds, perhaps starlings, but over time the jet would have become more and more accessible to larger and larger birds as the patches failed, leading to the resident pigeon population. One of the times I went out there, there was a hawk sitting up inside. It's like, oh, great, it's dinner time. The screening that you see was likely installed later, later date in response to the pigeons. The acidic mounds of nesting materials had taken their toll. And a number of the patches had, you can see here the corrosion, originally that was in fine condition. So they were severely corroded. The nesting material and droppings had also accelerated the rate at which the alclad skin had corroded. And some were missing like that, and then others were well on their way to being missing, like there. It's great corrosion photos, but if you're into corrosion like I am. And live and dead pigeons were present during the condition assessment. Unfortunately, I think the screening did more to trap the birds than it did to keep them out. It was well-meaning, but it didn't quite work. Okay, in addition to nesting in the jet, the pigeons found the top of the concrete pylon a convenient and desirable perch, giving them movement. Pigeons like to sit up and look down on things, right? So they got exactly what they wanted. And the steel support inside, although slightly corroded, was in very good condition. Okay, so what kind of treatment approach are we going to take to this? I advocated for conservation rather than a restoration approach. Despite the many condition issues, the decision was made to stabilize the jet in its current location, addressing the most pressing conservation concerns, which was the birds. We needed to get them out of the jet and keep them out of the jet. So evicting the birds, removing their nesting debris and excrement where possible, repairing the damage and sealing the large belly opening was essential. There was no appetite or budget for full restoration. And remember, this is a municipality. Okay, so in terms of a treatment approach, I essentially saw this as a big sheet metal project, because that's essentially what it is. Aluminum sheet metal fastened in place with pop rivets was used for all of the repairs. Only holes large enough to allow the birds access were patched. Smaller losses were left, essentially acting as weep holes. All the patches were fabricated to be sympathetic to the jet's original assembly. New patches were fabricated out of .032 gauge aluminum sheet metal and pop riveted in place. To further discourage the birds, an aluminum shroud or skirt was installed around the perimeter of the concrete base. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. As the project conservator, all the work was carried out under my supervision. So, the success of this project depended on hiring the right people for the job. The initial cleaning and sealing of the jet could be easily handled by city maintenance staff or outside contractors. However, the sheet metal repairs and fabrication and installation of the shroud were tasks best carried out by skilled sheet metal workers with considerable experience repairing historic sheet metal. This project requires someone who was detail-oriented, sensitive to the fact that they were working on essentially a museum object, and able to take direction, and also a really important thing. It was important that the city viewed this as a conservation treatment and not a sheet metal project. So we weren't putting in HVAC into schools and buildings. This was a museum object. The budget costs for this part of the project far surpassed the city's limit for sole sourcing. But thankfully, the city's project manager was able to persuade the purchasing department that the preservation of this jet was a special case. And that allowed us to hire Heather and Little Limited, and it's a firm that specializes in repairing and restoring historic sheet metal. And I was very happy about that. Okay, before any work began, there were certain safety concerns that needed to be addressed. Active jet fighters have a number of potentially dangerous components that need to be removed and or deactivated when a jet is decommissioned. I was advised that the city should ask the the Department of Natural Defense, who donated the jet in the first place, to check and confirm that at the time of decommissioning, the following tasks were undertaken. Number one, both ejection seats and canopy explosives deactivated and tagged as inert. And this is a project of mine a couple of years ago. I was hired by Science and Tech in Ottawa. This is a match set of Avro Aero ejection seats. So it's, yeah. And the widow of the man who got them in the 70s, he thought they were CF100. And it was only through his own research and diligence he discovered that they were not CF100, they were Avro. And they're labeled, and they go together. So anyway, these were being donated to Science and Tech. They were in this lady's barn, of course, and Science and Tech wanted me to go and see if I thought they were still live, because there are so many places on a jet and on an injection seat that have explosive squibs, right? And there's a lot of them, right? I honestly couldn't tell. It's the first ejection seat I ever had a look at, so it's not my area of expertise. I now know a lot more than I did before. But I took a lot of pictures, and I sent them back to Ottawa, and this gentleman, Reg, who is an aircraft maintenance engineer, he's part of the conservation department there. He took a look at the pictures, and as far as he was concerned, there was a potential that it was still live, right? Usually when D&D decommissions them, they have really big labels on them that say they're not active anymore. There were none of those, so that made us all a little worried. So a week later, they drove out from Ottawa, I came out from Toronto, and Reg carefully, and we had a big safety talk before anything happened, and a couple of times he'd go, you might want to stand over there when I take this one out, not there. But he was delightful and very carefully opened up all the areas. And they found 2 potential explosive squibs, which he labeled, and then packed them for transport back to Ottawa. And he is certified to transport explosives. So there were lots of jokes, but it is actually quite serious. So that was really important. The other things that had to be dealt with was the fire extinguishing system, which has methyl bromide in it, and that goes off with squibs. The oxygen system had to be drained and tagged inert, and all the accumulators drained at pressure. So the city staff were assured by D&D that the jet was fully decommissioned prior to being transferred to the municipality, so there were no outstanding issues. So at that point, it's like, okay, we can get started. Now, another concern is asbestos, which is found on hoses, heating ducts, ceiling strips. That was a concern because birds have been known to use that as nesting material. So we knew there was a potential for asbestos, and that combined with the toxicity of the bird droppings meant that all work had to be done wearing full PPE, and disposal had to follow proper provincial protocols. So the work began in the fall of 2012. At that time, the live birds were evicted and the netting removed, and a thick layer of debris, essentially bird carcasses, composted bird poop, had formed on top of the concrete mount, and a lot of it was held in place by the netting. And here he is shoveling bird poo off the top of the mount and whatever he can access inside. So what we could get at was removed. At this point, it hadn't gone inside the fuselage. So once the debris had been removed, the area was rinsed with water, and a local cleaning company, Spark Clean, came in with hot pressure washer and was able to give it a good clean. And then the folks from AAA Wildlife Control came in and did the final kicking the birds out and sealing it up. And basically what they did, which I thought was quite smart, is they just used pink fiberglass insulation to block all the access holes. And the nice thing about that is completely reversible. So when they're working on the jet, you can pull out the fiberglass where you're working that day, and at the end of the day, you can pick it back up. Now, so there it is. So the remainder of the work began in February 2013. Thankfully, it was a fairly mild February. And it was carried out solely by sheet metal worker Scott Farragher from Heather and Little, and this is Scotty here. And it was done either from a lift or a ladder. Initially, the port plywood engine plug was removed so that we could see the interior of the jet. And that's what you see here. It's really quite gross. The lower half of the engine, about 68 inches, was filled with bird debris nesting material and bird droppings. And further exploration, so gross. Further exploration proved that much of the interior, wings and fuselage, tip to tail, were filled with this material. The birds had obviously been there for quite a long time, and it was clear that this corrosive material had to be removed. As a result of this discovery, the scope of Heather Little's involvement expanded to removing all of the bird debris. This is painstaking and nasty work. In total, 8 large garbage bags of bird droppings and nesting material and carcasses were removed and disposed of properly. All were removed by hand using specially fabricated tools to reach as far into the jet as possible to get the debris out. And here we see, after cleaning, he did a really good job, I thought. Although the birds had been excluded in the fall, once the repair work began, they were quick to try and re-inhabit the jet. Both pigeons and starlings returned. Open areas, as I already mentioned, were plugged at night with the pink fiberglass insulation. But they were quite diligent, those birds. The existing sheet metal patches were unattractive and they weren't well fabricated. The metal had not been rolled to conform to the profile of the jet. And it was puckered on the edges, and in some cases it actually covered original striping on the jet, so it had to go. So basically the fasteners were drilled out and the sheeting was removed. The shroud, I talked about that before, was fabricated from the same sheet metal as the patches. And this is Scotty's drawing of it. So basically it's fastened to the underside of the jet, and it's also fastened to the concrete pylon. So it basically takes that perch away. They can't sit there. And here it is during installation. So that, I wish my pointer worked, but if you can see that little silver strip on 2 sides of the mount, that's basically how the sheet metal was attached to the concrete. Okay. And there were some pretty big expanses, and the large ones, Scott had to put in a strip that joined them, and then the sheet metal could go on top of that. The order in which the work was carried out was really important. So clearly you had to repair the belly by the concrete pylon before you put the shroud on. Here's some slides after. So you can see it's nicely conforms to the shape. And he boxed in the ends of those beams as well, because any point of access, they could get in, and they're very, very persistent. And then there was a sealant that ran around the edge, so it was very, very well sealed. Okay, so the severely corroded areas in need of repair had to be removed in order for an effective repair to be made. This one is toast, to use the technical term. But this was the exception rather than the rule. We really removed only a very few things. Removing these made it easier to clean out the jet because you had access. A missing navigational light cover on the port fuel tank was patched to keep the birds out, but if we only patched holes big enough that they could get in. If it was a small hole, we didn't worry about it. The plywood engine plugs were replaced, and a weep hole was installed, and I don't think you can see it, but at the bottom of that circle there's a little hole drilled in the wood. And that basically, as the name implies, allows any water that gets in there, whether it's from condensation, leaking in the jet, can weep out, right? Weep holes are a maintenance issue though. You do need to clean them out every once in a while, like once a year, because if they get blocked, then the water's not going to come out. The birds did remain persistent to the end. I hate these little guys. They used firecrackers like at the end, when the final piece went on, Scott threw in a bunch of firecrackers that scared the heck out of them, and they all left. And he said they would come flying over his shoulder and like bang into the jet. It's like, dude, it's shut, okay? We're done. Okay, so our goal from the beginning was that from a distance the repairs and the shroud would disappear. It would just look like a jet. But up close you could tell where the interventions were. So these are just a few before and after shots. I think Scott did a fabulous job. There we go. Look, it's just like ready to take off. And okay, so birds, like many animals, are habitual, returning year after year to establish a nesting site. And these guys were no different. So the jet, my recommendation was the jet be inspected every spring to ensure that they were unable to gain access, and if they were, to kick them out and close up the opening. So my recommendation was that it be inspected annually. And of course I recommended annual maintenance. So that's the inspection for the birds. It also means things like cleaning out the weep holes in the engine plugs, any of that debris and organic matter by the intake cowlings should be removed as well. Okay. So technically speaking, all this work was carried out under my supervision, but in reality, this really was a collaborative approach. Scott and I worked together throughout the entire project. He is a highly skilled sheet metal worker with decades of experience. He's incredibly fussy and detail-oriented, which is exactly what I want. He also maintained a sense of humor throughout the project, which is not always easy to do when you're like knee-deep in bird poo. Really, I mean, it's like, Scotty, good for you, not me. I believe the combination of a conservation approach and working with the skilled trades made this a successful project. All interventions from a conservation standpoint were completely reversible. If you didn't like the patch, you didn't like the shroud, you could take it off. And there you go.